I think I needed the sun out for this one. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 7 from Biosphere, Dropsonde. Alright, so, if people were weirded out by the extremity of Biosphere's previous album, Autour de la Lune, I can at least say you can rest easy knowing that he didn't have any further albums that sounded like that. And he even had a couple more great ones after that. And here's another one of them. One of the things I most like about Biosphere is the way that all of his albums, save for Potashnik, sound different from each other and have a vibe to them that you can't get elsewhere. This album, while it borrows a few ideas already explored previously on Cirque, it fleshes them out in an even more enjoyable way, and does its own thing with those kinds of sounds in such a way that it feels like this album did it first. Like, Dropsonde is most characterized by a few things. First of all, the somewhat jazzy tone of the breakbeats utilized in many tracks on this thing. They do have a light and smooth quality to them. Of course, you're not going to find any bangers, but I hope you wouldn't actually be expecting that out of a Biosphere album. Yes, these kinds of breaks were present on Cirque, but they're a lot more present and focused on here. It feels like a lot more of a defining feature. The other big defining feature of this album over any other albums of his is the much warmer and more comfortable tone it has. I did describe Cirque as being more comfortable in Substrata, but it was still a rather cold and detached listen. Dropsonde is Biosphere's rare summer album. The kind of album that actually does exude warmth, unlike the iciness of most of his other projects. One that actively aims to feel more comfortable and more agreeable and more laid back, rather than on Cirque, or that comforting feeling felt like more of a side effect that may or may not have been intentional in the first place. And perhaps unsurprisingly, each track is very minimalistic and repetitive, because of course, but Jansen has proven time and time again that he is great at putting out minimalistic stuff. Music that has little to nothing to it, but keeps you interested the whole time. I mean, there's a lot of tracks that have not much to them aside from like little plinking electric piano notes. The opener Dissolving Clouds, for instance. A track like this has a very Boards of Canada-esque quality to it, actually, but its subtle major chord that it forms does really have that warm and sunny feeling to it that you don't typically find in their music. Save for Campfire Head Phase, but even that wouldn't really fit on here, I don't think. But there's other tracks here just like it. From a Solid to a Liquid, it has all the same musical ingredients as the opener on top of a couple of subtle pads, but it feels a bit more melancholy in its tone on the whole. There's also the more tense and more rhythmic tones of a track like Alto Stratus, mostly comprised of intervals of bassy synth notes that switch off from playing two different chords that sound like they're imitating some chords you'd hear on like a grandfather clock. And while this track still feels rather warm, it does also kind of have a darkness to it, like having overcast skies and humidity during the summer. And of course there's the shifting and subtle closer, People Are Friends. I'll admit there's a part of me who wanted a little more progression out of this track, given its 10-minute length and the fact that all it really has is a bassy pad, some more of those BOC electric pianos, playing really toned down chords that do have a bit of a hopeful feeling to them. And in the back half also some echoey voice samples, but that's it. It's not really the kind of track that takes you on an evocative journey, but it also feels like a logically fitting and satisfying endpoint for this entire album, and one that I do feel like does its job very well as a closer, and can be just as evocative as any other tracks on this thing. It doesn't feel nearly as long as it actually is in spite of its simplicity. But okay, I think most of my favorite cuts from Dropsonde were the ones with the smooth and jazzy breakbeats on them. They bring a bit more energy, a bit more movement, and even if these tracks are basically stuck in a single loop, that loop will always feel really nice and not grow old. Like the second track, Birds Fly By Flapping Their Wings. The beat is shuffling and smooth, the repetitive licks of electric pianos are super subtle but do drive the mood well as the airy pads around it and whooshing sound effects that I suppose is supposed to resemble wings flapping. It is the kind of track that feels like it's just gliding through the air and is really effective in its subtlety as always. Also probably the one that sticks in my head the most frequently. And there's also the comparatively more exciting In Triple Time, which while also containing very similar break beats where you can hear plenty of quick banging on cymbals, still has a smoothness and classiness to it, while this progression of synth chords continues on to drive a fair bit of momentum, while this flutish pad floats over the mix occasionally. One of the consistent biggest highlights from this thing. But not all the breaks sound the same. Fall In, Fall Out, for instance, has a percussion track that seems pulled from this military-esque drum rolling, and it just marches on at a regular pace. But it still has those BOC-style electric pianos playing really toned-down and moody melodies on top, while some strange shifty pad plays way in the background. Could also be some kind of sample, but it's hard to tell. Pretty interesting track, that one. And there's also Daphnis 46, which doesn't actually have a break at first. Starts out with all these shifting Shenjo-esque loops that feel a bit disquieting, giving off this strange urgent feeling as if there's a fire starting somewhere that you can't see. And that feeling intensifies in the second half as the break slowly fades in underneath it, making this kind of mechanical marching that makes the track feel even more urgent and dangerous, but never going over the top with it or anything. And there are a couple of tracks that don't really fit into either category of the ambient BOC-like stuff or the vaguely jazzy break-driven material. Warmed by the Drift, for instance, is an ambient piece that, again, kind of feels like something from Shenju with its slowly shifting sample pads that feel pulled out of another era, creating a vibe which is both warm and comforting, but also mildly disquieting in some ways. Kinda hard to describe, but I like it a lot. Also brings in some distant guitar sounds and a really subtle bass line later on, but to help it feel like it has a bit more meat on its bones than most of the material from Shenjo. That's a pretty consistent favorite from this thing. There's also Arafura, which has all these shining and watery guitar sounds alongside some irregular cymbal patterns, or maybe I'm mistaking the cymbals for guitars. It all kind of comes together in a formless blob. But it's still quite evocative, and reminds me a lot of certain moments from the KLF's Chill Out. And finally, there's Sherbrooke, which has a lot of repetitive and chopped up guitar samples. Very simple track that builds a foot-tapping rhythm just out of the edit points of these samples, but also has plenty of warm pads around it and make it feel like one of the most lighthearted and uplifting moments on the album. Another great moment on this thing that was a consistent favorite. Oh yeah, and on the LP pre-release of the album, and as the single bonus track on its 2015 reissue, there's one more track called In the Shape of a Flute, which is yet another jazzy break track similar to Birds Fly by Flapping Their Wings, but having an even more hopeful and energetic feel to it. I think People Are Friends is a little better as an ending, but this could work just as well in that way. It's a pretty great track as well. So, that's Dropsonde. I really have nothing bad to say about this thing. It's a rock-solid project in my eyes, and there's no moment on here that feels less substantive than another or overstays its welcome. It's very well-balanced and well-varied. Now, on a personal level and how it stacks up against previous albums, I can say for certain it's better than Cirque. While Dropsonde rehashes a couple of ideas from that album, there were tracks like Algae and Fungi that had some jazzy drum breaks like those on here, but I associate those sounds a lot more with this album. They're a lot more definitively part of its identity, as mentioned before, and even better executed. But in terms of emotional content, I think I'd still just barely edge Shenjo over this. That project was a lot more haunting and personally affecting, and more impressive in how it feels like it conveys so much emotional nuance despite having far fewer musical elements than this does. But the overarching warmth of this one makes it a similarly big standout in a very different way. Not to mention I like the way this project feels like it has more meat on its bones. So yeah, I've listened to it quite a bit over the past couple of days, but I'm still not sick of it. It's just a pretty great project all around, and another one of the highest points in the Biosphere catalog. Definitely worth a shot, and I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.